Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Recha Kudash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Isaiah, the 23rd chapter. And as you can see in the subheading here, the fall of Tyre. So, this is Isaiah chapter 23, verse 1. The burden of Tyre. You know what? Let's do this here. Pronunciation. Tyre. Interesting. And yet I'm sure it'd be pronounced differently elsewhere. Let's take a look here. Let me see. Tyre. Bible. Okay, let's take a look at this.
We are looking at how to pronounce this name of this city in Lebanon. It is also an ancient Phoenician port city mentioned in the Bible. How do you pronounce it? Tyre. Tyre. In American English, in British English, it is said as Tyre. Tyre. And now you know. Here are more videos on how to pronounce
Tyre. Interesting. So not Tyre. Tyre. Okay, so we'll go with Tyre, as apparently that is the actual pronunciation. So, the burden of Tyre, howl ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, so that there is no house, no entering in. From the land of Kittim, it is revealed to them. Now, Tarshish here being Spain, okay, because keep in mind that Tyre and Sidon and that region, okay, known as Phoenicia, the people were a seafaring people, right? And they were very skilled at it. And so a lot of their, their role or their job or how they really became prominent in the earth was through conquering the seas, right? And also being great merchantmen by transporting goods to different regions. Because, for example, if Egypt had grain, right, they would basically, go to Egypt, they would get it, and then they would, transport it to different areas that needed that grain that didn't have it there. So they basically dominated like trade routes and so on and so forth. Okay, so that was one of the main significance of like Tyre, and Tarshish also being one of the regions that also would have their ships being sent back and forth, transporting goods and so on. So as it says here, howl ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste. Right, this is going into the calamities that would befall Tyre, and the it being laid waste here. Right, as it says, there is no house, no entering in. You can imagine this being like the harbor, right? Because if Tyre is now, under subjection or has suffered calamities, then they wouldn't be able to operate as they normally would, right? And so the ships that would travel from Tarshish and different regions to dock at the harbor of, or the coast of Tyre, they wouldn't be able to do that, right? Because you could say Tyre is now out of commission. And so that would be a loss for them, right? A cost and a loss for them. That's why it's saying here, how there is no entering in from the land of Kittim, which is Cyprus. It is revealed to them, meaning the news of Tyre's calamity is spread over there. Be still. Now, when you look into the word still here, it goes into basically like silent, and otherwise translated as, basically mourn in silence, right? Or be quiet about it. Ye inhabitants of the isles, which are the islands, thou whom the merchants of Zidon that pass over the sea have replenished. And so it's saying this to say that you had a lot of these islands, right? That's the isles that depended upon these regions, right? Like Tyre and Zidon, to transport different goods and resources and so on to them. Okay, so as it's saying here, it's signifying that they were going to be in distress upon hearing this, that the merchants who travel the seas that would usually replenish, right, when they bring certain goods to their areas and they trade with them, that would if they say the city was low on certain resources, then these merchantmen that travel the seas, right, the Phoenicians would be able to bring that to them, and then they could purchase it and so on and so forth, right, or trade with them. So not having that anymore would be a cause of distress for them. Verse 3, and by great waters, the seed of Sihor, which Sihor or Sihor is in Egypt, right? When you look it up, it's really referring to the grain of Egypt, because Egypt was known for exporting grain. All right, as it says here, a river or canal on east border of Egypt and a branch of the Nile. And even when you go into the time period, at least in the future of what we're reading of here, that's one of the reasons why the Romans protected the Egyptians from the invasion of Antiochus, when they sent, I believe his name was Gaius Linus Popilius. He basically stopped Antiochus from invading Egypt because Rome had interest in Egypt because they supplied them with grain. So as it's saying here in verse 3, right, the great waters, which these merchantmen or the Phoenicians traveled to replenish the islands, right, the different regions, the trade stops that they would make. And by great waters, they delivered, seed from or grain from Egypt. As it mentions, the harvest of the river, which the river here is referring to the Nile River, is her revenue, and she is a mart of nations, right? So they made their money or their profit from traveling to places like Egypt, getting that grain and getting those resources, and then selling it to these other nations around the different parts, mainly of the Mediterranean. And so that's why I mentions her being a mart of nations, right? Like a marketplace for the nations, because they would always have the bring the new stuff, where a lot of different nations would trade and buy and sell with them. Be thou ashamed, O Zidon, for the sea hath spoken, even the strength of the sea, right? Which is referring to Tyre, right? Being the strength of the sea. And it's referring to them as the strength of the sea because they dominated the sea, right? They dominated the trade routes. Okay. So as it says here, they have spoken, saying, I travail not, nor bring forth children, neither do I nourish up young men, nor bring up virgins. And so travailing here, it's like it's going into basically like going through pain. And it's more so geared towards like a woman who travails, meaning like she's going through like the birth cycle. But here, Tyre is saying, I'm not travailing. I'm not bringing forth children. I'm not nourishing up young men or bringing up virgins. Why? Because they've now been reduced, at least in prophecy, right? In what Isaiah is prophesying that would happen to them, they would be reduced, right, to a low state to where they wouldn't be dominating as they were before. Verse 5, as at the report concerning Egypt, so shall they be sorely pained at the report of Tyre. Now, when you read this in even different commentaries and the different translations, majority of them translate it as when this report or when this news comes to Egypt, they're going to be afraid or pained. But I think it makes more sense in the sense that when you read like a couple chapters before, remember Isaiah was prophesying not only against Israel, right, and Judah, but also against the nations. Okay, I believe he even prophesied against Moab and the various nations, including Egypt, which we read about, right? And so, I think it makes more sense that in reference here is that just like the report concerning Egypt wasn't good, right, and brought, distress upon people, so, or similarly, it's going to be when they hear the report of Tyre, i.e. the destruction that would come upon Tyre, or the calamity that would come upon them, it would equivocally bring about that anguish. to those that depended upon Tyre. Pass over to Tarshish, howl, ye inhabitants of the isles, or of the isle. And it's similar, right? Because like when you read in Revelation 18, it talks about how the let me see if I can get that real quick. How the merchantmen are gonna lament when Babylon is taken down. Here we go. This is Revelation 18:9. And the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her, with who? With Babylon, America, because Revelation 18 is going into the destruction of America and the aftermath. So they shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore. And that's that point right there, right? So this is an example of why certain merchantmen or nations would mourn, right, when another nation they depend on for buying their resources or selling their resources goes down, right, or suffers calamity. It affects them, right? It affects their economy. It affects their trade. It affects their citizens, right? So similarly to how these merchant men, right, or these merchants of the earth, when they mourn over the destruction of Babylon, it's not because they love Babylon or care about Babylon, but it's because they're now suffering loss at the destruction of Babylon. So similarly, when you go back to Isaiah 23, this is why it's saying, "Howl, ye inhabitants of the isles," because now you're affected by the taking down of Tyre, right, and them losing that dominant status and the ability to provide you with the resources that you depended upon them for. Verse 7, is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days? Right, and it's basically saying their history goes back to the ancient time, because Tyre was one of the oldest cities, right? It's a pretty, well, I don't want to say archaic, but it's a pretty old city, right? As it says here, her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn. Now, once again, you have some translations that point this towards, them colonizing different regions. But I think in the way that it's worded here, in the theme of this report, it alludes more to captivity, right? Because when you had certain nations being conquered and taken captive, like even what happened to Judah, they would be sent from their land to another land. Guess what? They weren't in the back of limousines, okay, or flying in economy on airplanes. They were shackled up and they had to walk on their feet. Hands shackled up, feet shackled up, and they would have to walk days and days and days and days and days. And some of them would die as they would make their way from the land where they dwelt to the land of their captivity. Okay, so similarly, as it says, their own feet or her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn. And that's why it starts off saying, is this your joyous city, right? Which has been here since the ancient times. And now look at them. Verse 8. Who hath taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, right, a city of renown, whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers, right, synonymous with merchants, are the honorable of the earth. So who is it that is counseled and came up with the plans to do this to Tyre, this prominent city that is pretty much well known? The Lord of hosts hath purposed it to stain the pride of all glory. So basically it's the Most High, right? And his purpose is to basically shut down their pride, because along with their success came pride and glory, or the glorifying in themselves, and to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. See? So how would he do this? By subjecting them either to another nation, by suffering calamities, right, that would basically reduce their status, similar to what the Lord did to Israel, from a glorious state to now, a low state that is borderline forgotten about. Okay, and you may you may think, right, like you barely hear about Tyre and Zidon and these regions. You hear about them every now and then, but not as much as you hear about like Babylon or the Greeks or Esau in the scriptures. But it doesn't mean that they were just perfect or they were saints or they were just innocent, right? If you were to take the time and read into like say their history and see how did they conduct themselves, how did they live, you'll see why the Lord had the prophets also prophesy upon the judgments he would bring to these nations as well. Because just because they're not in the spotlight, if you read the scriptures, you'll see that it's mainly the nation of Israel that's in the spotlight. And you see sort of the inner workings of how you go from disobedience to being warned to not taking heed to the warning and then being judged. And you see that life cycle like again and again and again pertaining to the Israelites. Well, it's similar with these heathens, except they're not the highlight of the Bible. So that's why their transgressions, if it's not really against Israel, it's barely recorded in the scriptures. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And it doesn't mean that the Lord still won't judge them for it. So that's why sometimes you'll read about some harsh judgments to these heathen nations, but in the same scriptures, you won't see every detail about the iniquities they committed to warrant those judgments. Okay. Verse 10. But you get some insight to it when you read some verses like this, that like the Lord said he's going to do this so he can stain their pride. And you're like, oh, well, okay, well, goes to show you that they were exhibiting that characteristic of pride. And why not? You know, being like the one of the top renowned cities or at that time. Verse 10, pass through thy land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish. Now, what does that mean? When you look at a river, wherever there's a path, it will go unrestricted, right? That's how like a river flows, right? You have waterfalls, right? It falls. It curves, it turns, wherever it can find, it will go without restriction, right? If you try to block it, eventually it'll build up and then overflow, right? If you try to stop its path, it will go around. So now, as it's saying here, pass through thy land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish, there is no more strength. And when you look into that word strength over here, I believe in the Hebrew, it goes into like a girdle. Yeah, like a girdle, right? And a girdle as like a belt, what it does is it holds like your garment and stuff in place, but it can also be thought of as like a restraint. So what's being mentioned or what's being said here in verse 10 is basically Tarshish, right? Which was also like, they also did trade. They had ships, right? They would also like seafaring people, but now they would have the freedom, right, to move more freely over those territories that originally were dominated by Tyre. But now with the calamity befalling Tyre and them losing that dominant status and that power, there would be less restraint over like trade routes and so on and so forth, that now regions and places like Tarshish could move freely into. And why is it mentioning this? It's mentioning this to signify and put more emphasis on the downfall of Tyre, at least for this period of time. Verse 11, he stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms, being the Most High, that is. And by him stretching out his hand over the sea, right, because that was the main place of focus right now, right? We're dealing with a seafaring people here. It means he directed his attention, right, to take action against, this particular region. As it says, he shook the kingdoms. The Lord Yahweh hath given a commandment against the merchant city to destroy the strongholds thereof. Now, keep in mind, Tyre, they were considered to be impregnable, meaning that you couldn't even besiege them, because there was they had a stronghold on the water, right? It was like a ways off of the coast of the land. And it would make it difficult for anybody to try and besiege them because they were on the water. Though Alexander was able to find a way to do it. But as it says here, right, the Lord has given a commandment to destroy the strongholds. So when the Lord, how would the Lord do that? By raising up another nation that would come and subject them into captivity, right? Verse 12, and he said, Thou shalt no more rejoice, O thou oppressed virgin, daughter of Zion, or Slakia, Zidon. And why is the daughter or Zidon sometimes is referred to as daughter of Zidon? Similarly, right, daughter of Zion still is referring to Israel. But why is it mentioning here them as an oppressed virgin? When you look into it, basically, the word oppressed, when you look into that word, it's just like destroyed or crushed. But in this context, is referring to like a defiled or like a touched virgin, right? Like a virgin, a woman that's not been touched. But in this case, they're going to be one that is touched, the daughter of Zidon. Why? Because they were, when a nation is likened unto a virgin, similar to how a real life woman who is a virgin, in the Bathwala sense, hasn't been touched, right, or been known by a man. When it applies to a nation, it's like a nation that hasn't been like invaded or taken down or really suffered like some major invasive catastrophic calamity, okay, either before or in memorable time. So with the judgment the Lord is going to bring upon both Tyre and Zidon, now it's referred to as like that virgin that's been touched, right? So don't rejoice anymore, because now you're finally going to be touched. As it says, arise, pass over to Kittim, which is Cyprus. There also shall thou have no rest. So even if you try to flee over to escape, you're still not going to be able to escape or have rest from what the Lord has pronounced against you. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, i.e. Babylon, this people was not, till the Assyrian founded it, for them that dwell in the wilderness. Now, when you go into like the history, right, going all the way back, right, you had, usually we talk about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, right, and then the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But prior to them, the word Neo means new, right? And prior to the Neo empires, you had the Middle Assyrian Empire and like the Middle Babylonian Empire. And then you had the Old Assyrian Empire and then the Old Babylonian Empire. And when you look at the regions where they were in, right, if we type in here the Old Assyrian Empire, or even if I just type in Mesopotamia, but I think we should be able to be good with this or this. So if you look here, in in the past, once these city states eventually advanced, and then you start to have like empires, the empires that were vied for power in this region, like the Assyrian Empire, it was mainly like the Assyrians, right? They would come up into power then for a period of time, and then Babylon would come up into power for a period of time, and this is like the ancient versions. So you would have Babylon in the south and Assyria in the north. And when one was in authority, you would have power over the region, and then vice versa. Okay. But basically, as Isaiah is saying here, that at one point the Babylonians weren't, as known or significant, right? At one point, Babylon wasn't what it became. It came to be known as, right? As it says, right, till it was founded, till the Assyrian founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness, which were still those that eventually came to be known as like the Babylonians. Because when you go into that time, the region of Babylon was a conglomerate of different people, right? Different nations of people that made their way in there and dwelt there, right? If you actually go to the origins of Babylon, not the Babylonian Empire, I think you even had like Amorites. Let's see if we can go into the history. Yeah, it says here the Old Babylonian period. According to the Babylonian king list, Amorite rule in Babylon began in the 19th or 18th century with a chieftain named Sumu Abum, who declared independence from the neighboring city-state of Kazalu. Sumu Lael, whose dates may be concurrent with those of Sumu Abum, is usually given as the progenitor of the first Babylonian dynasty. Babylon was initially a minor city-state and controlled little surrounding territory. Its first 4 Amorite rulers did not assume the title of king. And then it goes on and goes on and goes on. Let me see what else they have here. Yeah, so it says here, he conquered all of the cities and city-states of southern Mesopotamia, including Isin, Larsa, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, Kish, Adam, Eshnuna, Akshak, Shurupak, Bad, Tibira, Sippar, and Girsu, coalescing them into one kingdom ruled from Babylon. Hammurabi also invaded and conquered Elam to the east and the kingdoms of Mari and Ebla to the northwest after a conflict of the Old Assyrian period, yada, yada, yada. So the point is, Babylon wasn't always what it was, right? And in that region, because when you even go up into the time when the Neo-Babylonian Empire ended up revolting, right? They were still under the Assyrians. Okay, so if you look at the titles given to some of the Assyrian kings, it'll say like King of Babylon, King of Assyria, King of the 4 whatever, King of the world, right? So as it says here, and founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness, because you did have some wanderers, right, that eventually came to dwell in that region. They set up the towers thereof, they raised up the palaces thereof, and he brought it to ruin. So what it's saying here is that, in a nutshell, Babylon wasn't always great, right? When you go into history, the Assyrians had control over them and built them up, right? And even brought them to their ruin. And as we're about to keep on going, the point in this reference is to say, looking at even Babylon and how they could be taken down, you are no exception. Verse 14, howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste, being their strongholds, but also as a trading partner with a dominant trading force like Tyre. If they were to go down, that weakens you as well. Verse 15, and it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre shall be forgotten for 70 years, according to the days of one king. After the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as an harlot. And this 70 years is similarly, right, signifies, or what's the word I'm looking for here? We'll just go with signifies that period of captivity, which also coincides with the period of captivity that Judah went through under the Babylonians, right? Because when you go into the history, when Nebuchadnezzar came to that region, keep in mind, right, that we're talking about, let's see here, the Levant ancient map. So we're talking about this region here. This region, if you have a world superpower that has control over, say, Israel or Judah, they also have control over the other nations in this region. All right, meaning they've taken, because these superpowers, these empires, they don't take over just cities, they take over regions, and then they subject everybody else that's under that to them. So by the time they Nebuchadnezzar and them came and took over Israel, they had already also made their attack against the neighboring nations, including Syria, Lebanon, Phoenicia, Tyre, Zidon, and so on and so forth. So just as we were in captivity under the Babylonians, they were also subject to the Babylonians. Now, when you look up what actually happened, the Babylonians besieged Tyre. The siege wasn't successful, but the Babylonians managed to get them to submit and basically surrender themselves and become tributaries under Babylon. And by that time, right, that captivity, because even Jeremiah prophesied about it, 70 years. Though we know that when you look at the the span of the Babylonian Empire itself, it didn't go a full 70 years, but it was close enough, right? And you see that in the scriptures. Sometimes it's not an exact time, right, but more like a time frame. So in any case, within that time frame, with Tyre now being subject and being brought down and their power being broken, that's why it's mentioned them being basically forgotten, losing that dominant status that they had, right? According to the days of one king, or the lifespan of one king, after the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as an harlot. And in the 16th verse, it'll elaborate a bit on that. Now, why does it say shall Tyre sing as an harlot? A harlot is we know what a harlot is, but a harlot that's been forgotten, right? Who, say in her youth, was known, well known. As she becomes less popular, she uses different antics to try and draw that attention back to her so she doesn't just get forgotten. And so that's basically what, as it's saying here, Tyre will do after that period of captivity and being forgotten. They would try to get back to that estate that they were in, to try and, resume that power and that marketplace of the world. Verse 16, take a harp, go about the city, thou harlot, thou hast been forgotten. Make sweet melody, sing many songs, that thou mayest be remembered. See, so in comparison to a harlot, that things she would do to try and attract attention back to herself, that is basically, in a metaphorical way, what is being told here to Tyre, to try and get back their old prestige, one would say. Verse 17, and it shall come to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will turn to her hire, right? And that hire is like, remember, they're being likened unto a harlot here, right? So that hire is the pay or the wages of a harlot. And as it says here, she shall return to her hire. So when you look through our history, even though they basically went down for a period of time, they were subject for a period of time, they still came back as the merchantmen of the earth, you could say, right? At least for a good period of time after that captivity, to still be known as the dominant seafaring people, and basically the status they had before. Though it wasn't as prominent as it was before, it was still something. And so they were still able to receive the riches and the revenue that they got before from playing that role, similar to the harlot receiving her hire. As it says, and shall commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. And what that means here is, it's more in the sense of the interactions and the trade that they had with pretty much all the various main kingdoms of the known world at the time. Verse 18, and her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. It shall not be treasured nor laid up, for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord. This doesn't mean that all of a sudden the Lord is going to start dealing with the inhabitants of Tyre. What it means is their profits, their merchandise, their resources are going to be sanctified for the purpose of the Lord, okay, and more specifically for his people, right? So it's not going to be treasured nor laid up for those of Tyre, right? They're not going to be able to store it up for themselves, but rather her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord, which are who? Israel, to eat sufficiently and for durable clothing, because they were also known for having, making like special garments and so on. That's where you get that Tyrian purple, which was used to make, high class, rich garments, and different other resources. And this also signifies that Tyre would be one of the nations that would be subject unto Israel in the kingdom, right? When all these other nations are subject unto Israel, hence their resources and their merchandise would not be their own, but rather would be brought and supplied to the people of the Lord, being the Israelites. So that pretty much brings us to the end of the book of Isaiah, the 23rd chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Recha Kodash. And until next time, Shalom.